Melody's hands trembled as she held the statue closer to the kerosene lamp's flickering light. The whispered Latin prayers seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Ave Maria, gratia plena, words she recognized despite never having learned the ancient language. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed her palm against her chest, feeling the vibrations of her own rapid breathing, the only sound she'd been able to perceive since the tractor accident when she was 7. The blizzard intensified outside, rattling the loose window frames and sending snow spiraling past the frost-etched glass. Elton sat cross-legged on the threadbare rug before the wood-burning stove, sketching in his composition notebook with a stubby pencil, completely unaware that his mother's world had just shifted on its axis. His sandy hair caught the amber light as he glanced up at her with those earnest brown eyes that reminded her so painfully of his father. "This isn't possible," Melody told herself, setting the statue carefully on the windowsill. The marble figure was no larger than her thumb, yet every detail was exquisitely carved: the flowing robes, the serene expression, hands clasped in eternal prayer. Where had it come from? Their property had been in her husband's family for generations, but no one had ever mentioned religious artifacts buried in the garden. She moved to the kitchen, needing the familiar rhythm of preparing dinner to ground herself. The prayers followed her, growing stronger now, layering over each other in harmonious whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Melody gripped the edge of the chipped porcelain sink, squeezing her eyes shut. Stress hallucinations, that had to be it. Dr. Morrison had warned her that raising a child alone while running her small seamstress business from home could take a psychological toll. But when she opened her eyes, she could still hear them. Elton appeared at her elbow, tugging gently on her wool cardigan. She looked down to find him signing with animated hands. "Mum, are you okay? You look scared." Melody forced a smile and signed back. "Just tired, sweetheart. Did you wash your hands before coming inside?" "Yes, ma'am." His small fingers moved with practiced precision. Unlike other children his age, Elton had been signing since he could barely walk, growing up as her bridge to a world that often forgot people like her existed. "Do you like the present I found for you?" "It's beautiful," she signed truthfully. "Where exactly did you find it?" "Under the old roses by the fence. It was wrapped in something really old and gross. Looked like cloth, but it fell apart when I touched it." His excitement was infectious as he continued. "I think maybe angels buried it there for you, Mom." "Christmas angels?" Melody's breath caught. The roses by the back fence marked the oldest part of their property, land that had been homesteaded in the 1890s by German immigrants. Her husband, Jack, had always meant to research the previous owners, but never found the time before the cancer took him. She knelt to Elton's eye level, signing, "What made you dig there today?" His expression grew thoughtful. "I had a dream last night about a lady in white standing by those bushes. She was crying, but her tears looked like stars falling into the ground. When I woke up, I knew I had to dig there." A chill ran down Melody's spine that had nothing to do with the December cold seeping through the walls. She pulled Elton into a fierce hug, breathing in the scent of winter air and playground dirt that always clung to his hair. From the windowsill, she could swear the Virgin Mary statue was watching them. The prayers grew louder as evening deepened, weaving through the house like invisible threads. Melody tried to distract herself with mending Mrs. Peterson's torn coat, her fingers working the familiar motions of needle and thread while her mind raced. She'd built her life around adapting to silence, around reading lips and body language, around the visual cues that replaced the auditory world she'd lost. This shattered everything she understood about her limitations. By the time she tucked Elton into bed, the blizzard had transformed their farmhouse into an island surrounded by an ocean of swirling white. The wind had knocked out the phone lines, not unusual during Nebraska winter storms, but tonight it made their isolation feel absolute. As she kissed her son's forehead and watched him drift off to sleep, Melody wondered if she should wake him, bundle them both in blankets, and make the dangerous drive to town despite the weather. But as she stood in the doorway of his small bedroom, listening to prayers that couldn't possibly exist. She realized there was nowhere to run from a miracle. The statue waited on the windowsill, bathed in moonlight that somehow penetrated the storm clouds. And for the first time in 27 years, Melody Burns was afraid of what she might hear next. Melody didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table until dawn, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had grown cold hours ago, watching the statue on the windowsill. The Latin prayers had finally quieted around 3 in the morning, fading like radio signals at the edge of reception, but their absence felt worse than their presence, like holding her breath underwater, waiting for something inevitable to surface. When pale winter light finally crept through the frost-covered windows, she forced herself into the familiar rhythms that had sustained them for the past 3 years since Jack's death. Coffee first, always coffee. Then breakfast preparation while Elton slept in on this Saturday morning, scrambled eggs with cheese the way he liked them, and toast cut into triangles, because he still ate with his eyes as much as his stomach. Their morning routine was a carefully choreographed dance of survival. Melody had learned to read the subtle vibrations that told her when Elton's bare feet hit the hallway floorboards, could sense his sleepy presence in the doorway before he signed his groggy good morning. She'd catch his attention with a gentle wave, and he'd shuffle to the table still in his Batman pajamas, hair sticking up in impossible directions. This morning followed the same pattern, except for the statue watching from the windowsill and the fact that Melody kept turning towards sounds that shouldn't exist. "Did you sleep okay, Mom?" Elton's hands moved slowly, still clumsy with sleep. "Fine, sweetheart. Eat your eggs while they're warm." But nothing felt fine. For 27 years, Melody had built her identity around adaptation and self-reliance. She ran her seamstress business from the converted sunroom, taking in alterations and custom work from the handful of families scattered across their rural township. Mrs. Peterson needed her coat mended. The Kowalski twins required new confirmation dresses. Tom Fletcher's wife had ordered curtains for their front parlor. These relationships sustained them, not just financially but socially. In a community where many people had never learned to sign, Melody had become the woman who somehow made everyone feel heard, despite her inability to hear them. She read lips with uncanny accuracy, anticipated needs, communicated through gestures and written notes, and the kind of intuitive understanding that came from years of watching people more carefully than they watched themselves. After breakfast, she settled into her sewing corner while Elton built elaborate Lego cities on the living room floor. The Singer sewing machine had been Jack's wedding gift to her, a 1965 model that ran smooth as silk and never missed a stitch. Her fingers found their rhythm in the familiar work, measuring, pinning, cutting, stitching. These were the motions that paid their mortgage, kept food on the table, and bought Elton's school clothes. But today, even the sewing felt different. Every few minutes she'd catch herself pausing mid-stitch, turning toward the windowsill where the statue waited. The marble figure seemed to draw her attention like a magnet, demanding acknowledgement of the impossible thing that had happened in the darkness. Around noon, Elton appeared at her elbow with his winter coat already zipped. "Can I go build a snow fort in the backyard?" Melody nodded, watching through the window as her son tramped through knee-deep snow toward the spot where he'd unearthed the statue. His laughter was visible in his body language, the way his shoulders shook, how he threw handfuls of snow into the air just to watch them sparkle in the weak sunlight. This was what she had to lose, she realized, this perfect small life they'd built together in the aftermath of tragedy. Jack's death had nearly destroyed her. For months after the funeral, she'd moved through their daily routines like a ghost, going through the motions of living while feeling nothing but the vast emptiness where her husband's presence used to be. Elton had been only 4 then, too young to fully understand why Daddy wasn't coming home, but old enough to sense his mother's grief. They'd survived by creating new traditions, new rhythms, Saturday morning pancakes, Sunday afternoon walks to the creek, reading time before bed, where Elton would tell her stories with his hands, painting pictures in the air that were more vivid than any book. She'd learned to find joy again in his wonder at small things, fireflies in summer, the first snow, the way ice crystals formed on their windows during the coldest nights. Now this statue threatened to unravel everything, not because it was dangerous exactly, but because it represented a world beyond her understanding, a world where impossible things could happen without warning, where the carefully constructed boundaries of her reality might dissolve at any moment. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, Melody found herself standing before the windowsill again. The statue seemed different in daylight, less ethereal, more substantial. Just a piece of carved marble that had somehow survived decades buried in frozen ground. But as evening approached, and Elton came inside with snow-crusted mittens and wind-burned cheeks, Melody felt the familiar tightness in her chest that meant the prayers were returning. Tonight would bring another test of everything she thought she knew about the limits of her world, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to hear it. Melody was ladling beef stew into bowls when the first visitor arrived. She felt the vibration through the floorboards before she saw the headlights cutting through the early evening darkness. A truck door slammed somewhere beyond the frost-covered windows, followed by heavy footsteps on the porch. Elton looked up from his drawing, eyebrows raised in question. They rarely had visitors, especially not during winter storms. The knock came firm and urgent against their front door. Melody wiped her hands on her apron and moved cautiously toward the entrance. Through the narrow window beside the door, she could make out a familiar silhouette, Tom Fletcher from the neighboring farm, his usually proud shoulders hunched against the cold. But something was wrong with his posture, a desperate slump that spoke of exhaustion or grief. She opened the door to find Tom cradling his 8-year-old daughter Sarah in his arms. The child's face was flushed with fever, her small body limp against her father's chest. Tom's lips moved rapidly, and Melody focused on reading the panic in his expression as much as his words. Dr. Morrison, roads blocked. Heard about miracle. The last word hit Melody like a physical blow. Miracle. How could Tom Fletcher possibly know about the statue, about the impossible prayers that had filled her house with ancient voices? She stepped aside, gesturing them into the warmth. Tom carried Sarah to the living room couch, settling her gently among the cushions. Elton appeared at Melody's side, his young face creased with concern as he watched the sick girl. Melody knelt beside the couch, pressing her palm to Sarah's forehead. The child's skin burned with fever, and her breathing seemed shallow, labored. Tom's desperate eyes met hers, and she read his lips as he explained, "Started this morning. Getting worse. Can't get to town." But then Tom said something that made Melody's blood freeze, Mrs. Peterson. She told us what happened to her arthritis after she touched it. Touched what? But Melody already knew the answer. Somehow, word had spread about the statue, about whatever had happened to their elderly neighbor, something Melody herself didn't understand. Tom's gaze moved to the windowsill where the Virgin Mary figure stood silhouetted against the storm-dark glass. "Please." His lips formed the word with devastating clarity. "She's all I have left since Martha died." Melody's hands trembled as she looked from the fevered child to the marble statue that had upended her carefully ordered world. This was the choice she'd sensed approaching, not just whether to believe in the impossible, but whether to act on it, whether to risk everything she'd built on the foundation of something she couldn't understand. Sarah stirred restlessly, a soft moan escaping her parched lips. Her father smoothed her hair with work-roughened hands, and Melody saw her own desperation reflected in his face, the same terror she'd felt watching Jack waste away, helpless to stop the progression of his illness. But this time, maybe helplessness wasn't her only option. Melody rose slowly and walked to the windowsill. The statue seemed to pulse with warmth as she lifted it, though that could have been her imagination. The marble felt alive somehow, humming with potential energy that made her palms tingle. She returned to the couch and sat beside Sarah's still form. Tom watched with the desperate hope of a drowning man reaching for a rope. Elton moved closer, his small hand finding his mother's arm in a gesture of support. For a moment, Melody hesitated. Touching the statue to a sick child felt like crossing a threshold she could never uncross. It meant accepting that miracles were possible, that the ordered world she deconstructed might be far stranger and more dangerous than she'd imagined. Sarah's breathing hitched, becoming more labored. Tom's face crumpled with fear. Melody gently placed the statue in the child's burning hands. The change was immediate and undeniable. Sarah's breathing deepened, becoming steady and natural. The flush faded from her cheeks like water absorbing into dry ground. Her eyes fluttered open, clear and bright, no longer glazed with fever. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. Tom's sob of relief filled the room as he gathered his daughter into his arms. Sarah sat up easily, completely alert, reaching for the cup of water Elton quickly fetched from the kitchen. The transformation was so complete it seemed impossible, except that Melody had witnessed it with her own eyes. As Tom held his healthy daughter, tears streaming down his weathered face, more headlights appeared in the driveway. Then more. Word was spreading through their isolated community with the speed that only desperate hope could achieve. Melody clutched the statue against her chest, feeling the weight of what she'd just unleashed. The prayers were returning now, stronger than ever, filling her ears with ancient words of praise and supplication. Outside, car doors slammed and voices called through the wind as neighbors arrived seeking their own impossible salvation. The ordinary world was ending. Whatever came next would test everything she thought she knew about faith, about sacrifice, about the price of answered prayers. But as she watched Elton sign excitedly to Sarah about his snow fort, Melody realized the choice had already been made the moment her son placed that first gift in her hands. The Fletchers had barely driven away when Melody locked the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the front window she could see more headlights approaching through the blizzard, distant stars growing brighter as desperate neighbors navigated the treacherous roads toward their isolated farmhouse. She pressed her palms against the cold wood of the door as if she could physically hold back what was coming. The statue felt heavy in her other hand, no longer the innocent Christmas gift Elton had unearthed from their frozen garden. It had become something else entirely, a beacon that was drawing the sick and desperate from across their rural township. Elton appeared beside her, his small face creased with confusion. "Why do you look scared?" Sarah got better. "That's good, right?" Melody knelt to his level, her hands shaking as she signed back, "Yes, sweetheart. But sometimes good things can also be complicated." How could she explain to a 7-year-old that miracles came with consequences she was only beginning to understand? That healing Sarah Fletcher had felt like opening a door she didn't know how to close. The Latin prayers were growing stronger again, weaving through the house with increasing urgency. But now Melody could hear something else beneath the ancient voices. Car engines fighting through snowdrifts, boots stumping up porch steps, desperate conversations carried on the wind. Her quiet sanctuary was about to become something she'd never asked for and wasn't sure she could handle. "Are more people coming to see your statue?" Elton's hands moved with the innocent directness that always cut straight to the heart of things. "I think so." Melody stood slowly, moving to peek through the frost-covered window. At least 3 more vehicles were making their way up the long dirt road that led to their property. "Elton, I need you to go to your room and stay there until I say it's okay to come out." "But why?" His expression shifted from confusion to hurt. "Don't you want me to help?" The first knock came before she could answer. Firm, insistent, followed immediately by another at the back door. Melody felt trapped, caught between the impossibility of what the statue could do and the very real fear of what might happen when word spread beyond their small community. What if someone got hurt? What if someone didn't heal? What if the authorities decided she was running some kind of scam, preying on desperate families? She'd heard stories about people who claimed to perform miracles, the investigations, the accusations, the lives destroyed by good intentions and circumstances beyond their control. 3 years of carefully rebuilt stability could evaporate overnight. "Please, Mom." Elton tugged on her sleeve, his eyes wide with the kind of earnest conviction that made her heart ache. The lady in my dream said this was supposed to happen. She said you were supposed to help people." Another knock, more urgent now. Through the window, Melody could see Mrs. Kowalski from 2 farms over, her arthritic hands wrapped around a bundle that might have been her chronically ill granddaughter. Behind her, old Mr. Henley leaned heavily on a walker, his breathing visible in white puffs as he waited in the cold. These weren't strangers looking to exploit something they'd heard rumors about. These were neighbors, people who'd helped them after Jack died, who'd hired her sewing services even when money was tight, who'd included Elton in community events and learned basic signs to communicate with her. People who were suffering and who somehow believed she might be able to help. But belief and ability were different things entirely. Melody clutched the statue tighter, feeling its impossible warmth against her palm. What if Sarah's healing had been a fluke? What if touching the marble to other sick people did nothing, or worse? What if it somehow made them sicker? She had no instruction manual for divine intervention, no way to understand the rules governing whatever power had flowed through the carved Virgin Mary. The prayers in her ears reached a crescendo, layering over each other until they sounded like a choir of 1,000 voices. But instead of comfort, they brought a crushing weight of responsibility she'd never asked for and wasn't sure she deserved. "I'm scared," she signed to Elton, the admission slipping from her fingers before she could stop it. Her son's expression softened with a wisdom that seemed far too old for his 7 years. He reached up and took her free hand in both of his small fingers warm against her cold skin. "It's okay to be scared," he signed back. "Daddy always said being brave means doing the right thing even when you're scared." The knocking came again, more insistent now, accompanied by muffled voices calling her name through the storm. Outside, more headlights appeared in the distance, creating a convoy of hope and desperation that would soon surround their small farmhouse. Melody closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down on her shoulders like the winter sky itself. Whatever she decided in the next few moments would change everything. For Elton, for their quiet life, for her understanding of what was possible in a world she'd thought she finally understood. The statue pulsed warm in her hand, waiting. Melody opened her eyes and looked at her son's trusting face, then at the statue glowing warm in her palm. The Latin prayers reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very walls, and she understood with crystalline clarity that this moment would divide her life into before and after. She walked to the front door and turned the deadbolt. The mechanism clicked with the finality of a gunshot, and Melody felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, as if a dam had burst and years of careful control were washing away in the flood. There would be no going back to their quiet evenings by the fire, no pretending the statue was just an interesting artifact Elton had found in the garden. Whatever lay beyond this door would demand everything she had to give. Mrs. Kowalski stood on the porch with tears freezing on her weathered cheeks, cradling her 10-year-old granddaughter Anna against her chest. The child's twisted leg braces caught the porch light, metal gleaming against the dark wool of her coat. Behind them, Mr. Henley wheezed with each labored breath, his oxygen tank strapped to his walker like a mechanical prayer. "Melody." Mrs. Kowalski's lips formed the words with desperate precision, knowing Melody would read them. "Please, Anna hasn't walked without pain in 3 years. If there's any chance..." Melody stepped aside, opening her home to the impossible. They came in waves after that, a steady stream of neighbors she'd known for years but was seeing clearly for the first time. The Hendersons brought their youngest son, whose asthma attacks had been growing worse each winter. Maria Santos carried her newborn daughter, born 3 months early and still fighting for every breath. Even Pastor Williams from the Lutheran Church arrived, supporting his wife Eleanor, whose cancer treatments had left her hollow-eyed and skeletal. Each person who entered brought their own constellation of pain, their own desperate hope wrapped in winter coats and carried in trembling hands. Melody's living room transformed into something between a field hospital and a chapel, filled with the quiet desperation of people who had exhausted medical options and were reaching for something beyond human understanding. The statue seemed to grow heavier with each healing, pulsing with a warmth that climbed her arm and settled somewhere behind her sternum. Anna Kowalski was the first, her leg braces clattering to the floor as she stood without assistance, tears of joy streaming down her grandmother's face. Mr. Henley's breathing cleared so completely that he forgot his oxygen tank by the door. The Henderson's boy took his first full breath in months. With each touch of marble to suffering flesh, Melody felt herself crossing another threshold. The careful boundaries she'd constructed around her identity, widow, mother, seamstress, deaf woman who'd learned to navigate a hearing world, dissolved like sugar in rain. She was becoming something else, something she had no name for and no training to understand. The Latin prayers swelled with each healing, but now she could distinguish individual voices in the supernatural chorus. Some sounded ancient, echoing with the weight of centuries. Others felt more recent, as if they belonged to people who had prayed these same words in times of plague and war and personal devastation. All of them seemed to be urging her forward, deeper into this impossible calling. Elton moved through the crowded room like a small ambassador, bringing water to the weak and translating between his mother and the visitors who hadn't learned to sign. His face glowed with a mixture of wonder and pride that made Melody's heart clench. This was the world she was choosing for him, not the quiet predictability of their old life, but something vast and uncertain and potentially dangerous. By midnight, word had spread beyond their immediate neighbors. Cars with license plates from 3 counties over struggled through the blizzard, their occupants carrying loved ones who had nothing left to lose. Melody's hands ached from holding the statue, and her mind reeled from the parade of impossible healing she'd witnessed. Cancers vanished, broken bones mended, failing organs restored themselves to perfect function. But with each miracle came a corresponding weight of responsibility that settled on her shoulders like lead. These people would go home and tell others. Word would spread through social networks and church congregations and medical communities. Eventually, someone would ask questions she couldn't answer. Eventually, the world beyond their rural township would take notice. As she touched the statue to the fevered forehead of a baby whose parents had driven through the blizzard from 3 counties away, Melody realized she was no longer the woman who had awakened that morning worried about mending Mrs. Peterson's coat. That person belonged to a smaller, simpler world that no longer existed. The threshold had been crossed. There was no path back to ordinary. The baby's fever broke instantly, and her parents sobbed with relief as color returned to their daughter's cheeks. Outside, more headlights approached through the storm, and Melody understood that this was only the beginning. The 13th healing shattered something inside Melody's chest. As the baby's fever broke and her parents wept with relief, Melody felt the statue's warmth spread up her arms like molten silver, carrying with it a crushing realization she had no idea what she was doing. Each miracle felt like signing a contract written in a language she couldn't read, agreeing to terms that grew more complex with every touch of marble to suffering flesh. "Mrs. Burns?" A voice cut through the reverent murmur filling her living room. A tall man in an expensive overcoat stood by the door, his calculating eyes taking inventory of the scene, the healed neighbors, the discarded medical equipment, the small statue glowing in her hands. "My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I drove down from Lincoln when I heard about this." Melody's blood chilled. She recognized the type, skeptical, scientific, the kind of man who would demand explanations she couldn't provide. Behind him, a woman with a press badge tucked into her coat pocket whispered into a small recording device. But before Dr. Webb could speak again, Mrs. Peterson stepped between them. The elderly woman's arthritic hands moved with surprising grace as she signed, her fingers spelling out words meant for Melody's eyes alone. "Be careful. That one wants to prove you're a fraud." The warning hit Melody like cold water. In her focus on the immediate need of each suffering person, she'd forgotten that miracles attracted more than just the desperate. They drew investigators, skeptics, people who made careers out of exposing the impossible as elaborate tricks or psychological manipulation. "I'm here to observe," Dr. Webb announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I specialize in psychosomatic disorders. What I've witnessed tonight suggests either mass hysteria or an elaborate—" "Get out." The words came from Pastor Williams, still supporting his wife Eleanor, whose cancer-ravaged body had been restored to health just an hour earlier. "This is a private home, not a laboratory." Dr. Webb's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Actually, Pastor, when someone claims to perform medical miracles, it becomes a matter of public health. The state has an interest in protecting vulnerable people from exploitation." Melody felt the room divide around her like a stone thrown into still water. On one side, her neighbors, people who had witnessed the healings, who had felt the impossible restoration of their bodies or watched it happen to their loved ones. On the other, the representatives of a larger world that demanded proof, documentation, scientific verification of things that existed beyond the reach of instruments and measurements. Elton appeared at her side, his small hand finding hers. Through their joined fingers, she felt his trembling, not with fear, but with indignation. His 7-year-old sense of justice couldn't understand why anyone would want to stop something that helped sick people feel better. "Mom," he signed urgently, "the lady from my dream is back." Melody followed his gaze to the kitchen doorway, where shadows seemed to gather with unusual density. For just a moment, she thought she glimpsed a figure in ancient robes, a woman whose face carried the weight of centuries and whose eyes held both infinite compassion and terrible warning. The figure raised one hand in what might have been blessing or caution, then dissolved back into ordinary darkness. But the message was clear: challenges were coming that would test more than her faith. "I'll need to examine the statue," Dr. Webb continued, pulling on latex gloves. "Run some basic tests. If this is legitimate, scientific documentation will only strengthen your case." "No." Melody's voice surprised everyone, including herself. She hadn't spoken aloud since the healings began, relying instead on sign language and the universal communication of touching the statue to suffering bodies. "You don't understand what you're asking." Dr. Webb's eyebrows rose. "I'm asking for verification. Surely if God is working through you, he wouldn't object to a little scientific scrutiny." The statue pulsed warm against Melody's palm, and suddenly the Latin prayers grew urgent, almost frantic. Through the supernatural voices, she heard something else, a whispered warning that made her skin crawl with premonition. Mrs. Kowalski stepped forward, her healed granddaughter Anna holding her hand. "Doctor, my Anna couldn't walk this morning. Now look at her." The child took a few dancing steps, her legs strong and straight, the twisted braces forgotten on the living room floor. "Psychosomatic improvement," Dr. Webb replied dismissively. "The power of suggestion can produce temporary—" Anna kicked him in the shin. "My legs work fine," she announced with 7-year-old authority. "I'm not crazy, and neither is Mrs. Burns." A ripple of protective anger moved through the room. These weren't gullible people desperate to believe in fairy tales. They were farmers and mechanics, teachers and small business owners, practical people who understood the difference between hope and reality, between wanting something to be true and watching it happen before their eyes. But Melody realized Dr. Webb's challenge was only the beginning. As more headlights approached through the storm, she understood that the world beyond their rural community was taking notice. And not all of it would come with pure motives. The real test was just beginning. The convoy of headlights approaching through the blizzard stretched longer than Melody had ever seen on their remote farm road. Each set of lights represented another desperate family, another impossible hope, another weight added to the crushing responsibility that had already transformed her simple life beyond recognition. Melody. Pastor Williams moved closer, his wife Eleanor's restored vitality a stark contrast to the skeletal woman who had arrived just hours earlier. "You need to know, I called Father Mackenzie at St. Margaret's before we came. He's driving down from Omaha with some church officials." The statue grew cold in her hands for the first time since the healings began. Church officials meant questions about doctrine, about the proper channels for divine intervention, about whether a deaf widow in rural Nebraska had any right to be conduit for the impossible. It meant investigations that could separate her from Elton, institutions that might declare her unfit or dangerous. Dr. Webb smiled at this information, making notes in a small leather journal. Excellent. Multiple perspectives will help establish a clearer picture of what's actually happening here. What's wrong? Elton's hands moved urgently, reading the fear that must have been written across her face. Before Melody could answer, Mrs. Peterson appeared at her elbow with the practical wisdom that came from 7 decades of small-town living. "There's a back door," the elderly woman signed quietly. "Take Elton and go. This is about to become something you can't control." But even as part of Melody longed to grab her son and disappear into the storm, she watched 3-year-old Tommy Henderson take his first steps without the leg braces that had defined his short life. His parents sobbed with joy as he toddled across the living room, reaching for his mother with perfect balance. How could she run from this? How could she deny other families what the Hendersons had just received? The front door opened again, admitting a blast of Arctic air and 2 figures who made Melody's heart sink. Sheriff Garrett's uniform was unmistakable even under his heavy winter coat, and the woman beside him carried the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having authority respected without question. "Mrs. Burns." Sheriff Garrett's expression was carefully neutral, but Melody had known him long enough to read the reluctance in his eyes. "This is Agent Patricia Morse from Child Protective Services. We've received some calls about unusual activities involving a minor." The words hit Melody like physical blows. They were here about Elton, about whether a 7-year-old should be exposed to whatever was happening in their living room, about whether a mother who was experiencing impossible things could be trusted to make rational decisions about her child's welfare. Elton pressed closer to her side, his small body trembling not with fear, but with defiant protectiveness. The same fierce loyalty that had led him to give her the statue now made him step partially in front of her, as if his slight frame could shield her from the gathering storm of official scrutiny. "The child appears healthy," Agent Morse observed, her clinical gaze cataloguing every detail. "But reports suggest he's been exposed to crowds of strangers, potentially dangerous situations, and claims of supernatural phenomena. We need to ensure his safety and psychological well-being." "He's fine," Dr. Webb interjected with newfound enthusiasm. "Actually, I'd like to interview him separately. Children often provide the most honest accounts of what they've actually witnessed versus what adults have convinced them to believe." The protective anger that rose in Melody's chest was so fierce it momentarily drowned out even the Latin prayers. These people were treating Elton like evidence to be examined, his innocent faith like a symptom of manipulation or delusion. They couldn't see what she saw, a little boy whose pure heart had somehow opened a doorway to the impossible. Mrs. Kowalski stepped forward again, Anna's hand firmly in hers. "Sheriff, I've known this family for 8 years. Melody Burns is one of the finest mothers in this county. Whatever's happening here, it's not hurting that boy." A murmur of agreement rose from the healed neighbors, but Melody could see how the official presence was changing the atmosphere. The sacred space that had formed around suffering and healing was becoming something else. A crime scene, an investigation, a problem to be solved by people who measured everything by rules and regulations that had no room for miracles. Through the kitchen window, she glimpsed more vehicles arriving. News vans with satellite dishes, official cars with government plates, and what looked like a church convoy led by a black sedan that probably carried Father Mackenzie and his ecclesiastical authority. The Latin prayers in her ears shifted tone, becoming urgent warnings layered with what sounded like grief. The supernatural voices that had guided her through the evening's healings now seemed to be mourning something that was ending before it had truly begun. The statue pulsed once against her palm, then went completely still. In that moment of crystalline clarity, Melody understood that she was no longer deciding whether to help people who needed healing. She was preparing for a battle that would determine whether Elton would remain her son. Agent Morse pulled out a clipboard, her pen clicking with bureaucratic finality. "I need to speak with the child privately. Standard protocol when investigating potential neglect or endangerment." "No." The word tore from Melody's throat with such force that several people stepped back. The statue blazed to life in her hands, its marble surface growing so warm it nearly burned her palms. Around the room, the recently healed neighbors moved closer, forming an unconscious protective circle. Dr. Webb looked up from his notes, eyes gleaming with scientific hunger. "Actually, Agent Morse, I'd like to observe that interview. The psychological dynamics here are fascinating. A deaf mother, claims of religious phenomena, a child who may have been coached to support elaborate delusions. Nobody," Sheriff Garrett said quietly, "is taking that boy anywhere tonight." The sheriff's unexpected support should have provided relief, but Melody could see the careful calculation behind his words. He was buying time, not choosing sides. The moment he received direct orders from county or state authorities, his protection would evaporate like morning frost. Through the kitchen window, more vehicles disgorged their passengers. A news crew struggled through the snow with cameras and lights. 3 men in black coats and clerical collars approached the front door with grim determination. And behind them, a van marked with the state seal, more officials drawn like moths to the impossible flame burning in her living room. "Mom," Elton tugged at her sleeve, his signs quick and urgent. "The lady says to show them." "What lady?" Melody's hands moved automatically, but her eyes never left Agent Morse's predatory smile. "The one from the kitchen. She says they won't believe until they see what happens to someone who tries to take the statue away from us." Ice flooded Melody's veins. The mysterious woman who had appeared to Elton throughout this ordeal had never given advice that led to safety, only to deeper mysteries, greater challenges. If she was suggesting they demonstrate something, Dr. Webb apparently caught some of their signed exchange. "I really must insist on examining that statue. Basic authentication tests, material analysis, checking for any mechanical components that might produce heat or—" "Don't." The warning came from Mrs. Peterson, her elderly voice cutting through the room's tension like a blade. "Don't you dare reach for that statue, young man." But Dr. Webb was already moving, his latex-gloved hands extending toward the marble figure with clinical confidence. "Madam, I'm trying to help expose whatever fraud—" The moment his fingers brushed the statue's surface, the temperature in the room plummeted, not gradually but instantaneously, as if winter itself had crashed through the walls. Dr. Webb's confident expression transformed to shock, then agony, as frost began forming across his gloves. He tried to pull his hands away but couldn't. His fingers seemed frozen to the marble surface. "Help me," he gasped, his breath visible in the suddenly arctic air. "I can't. It won't let go." The Latin prayers exploded in Melody's ears, no longer whispered but shouted, as if a cathedral full of voices had suddenly found urgent need to be heard. Through the supernatural chorus, she understood with terrible clarity what was happening. The statue was defending itself and, by extension, defending her and Elton from those who would separate them. Agent Morse fumbled for her radio. "I need backup at the Burns residence immediately. We have a situation involving—" The radio crackled with static, then went dead. Every electronic device in the room, phones, watches, the reporter's camera equipment, fell silent simultaneously. Outside, car engines sputtered and died. The only light came from the living room lamps and the unearthly glow now emanating from the statue itself. Dr. Webb's agonized breathing filled the sudden silence. His hands were turning blue where they touched the marble, but his eyes had begun to change too. The clinical skepticism was melting away, replaced by something approaching awe. "I can hear them," he whispered through chattering teeth. "The voices, they're showing me things. About the fire 50 years ago, about a woman who died protecting—" His words dissolved into Latin phrases he clearly didn't understand, but couldn't stop speaking. Melody felt the power flowing through her like electricity through copper wire, not generated by her, but channeling through her from some source vast and ancient. The statue pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and she realized with mounting terror that she was no longer controlling what happened next. The same force that had enabled the healings was now protecting itself with methods that had nothing to do with mercy. "Please," she whispered to the empty air where shadows suggested the mysterious woman's presence, "don't hurt him. He doesn't understand." The response came not as words, but as images flooding her mind, bureaucrats separating mothers from children, scientists dissecting sacred relics, authorities crushing miracles under the weight of regulations and institutional skepticism. This was what happened when the divine touched the world. It was questioned, catalogued, regulated, and ultimately destroyed by people who confused control with understanding. Elton stepped forward, his 7-year-old voice clear and steady in the frozen air. "Let him go. He's scared." The statue released Dr. Webb so suddenly he collapsed to his knees, gasping and cradling his frost-burned hands against his chest. The temperature began to return to normal, but the message was unmistakable. Some doors, once opened, could not be closed by human authority. Dr. Webb struggled to his feet, his face pale with shock and something deeper, the look of a man whose understanding of reality had just been shattered beyond repair. Agent Morse knelt beside him, checking his pulse while shooting terrified glances at the statue that had returned to its innocent marble appearance. "We need to evacuate this house," she announced, her professional composure cracking. "Whatever's happening here, it's dangerous. The child needs to be removed immediately for his own safety." The words hit Melody like a physical blow. She clutched Elton closer, feeling his small body tense with understanding. Through their joined hands, she felt his fear, not of the statue or the supernatural forces swirling around them, but of being taken away from her. Sheriff Garrett cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Agent Morse, I think we need to reassess." "Sheriff, I have authority here." She pulled out her phone, cursing when it remained dead. "This situation has escalated beyond local jurisdiction. That child is in immediate danger from whatever psychological manipulation is occurring." Mrs. Kowalski stepped forward, her healed granddaughter Anna pressed against her side. "The only danger here comes from people who want to destroy something beautiful because they don't understand it." But even as her neighbors rallied around her, Melody could see the writing on the wall. The authorities had arrived, with predetermined conclusions, and Dr. Webb's supernatural encounter had only convinced them that Elton was being exposed to dangerous forces. They would take him away for his protection, and no amount of community support would stop them once the legal machinery began moving. Through the kitchen window, she watched Father Mackenzie and his church officials approach through the storm. More help or another threat. The Catholic Church had its own ways of dealing with claimed miracles, investigations that could take years, during which Elton would likely be placed in protective custody away from her influence. The statue grew cold in her hands again, but this time the chill felt different, not angry or protective, but mournful. The Latin prayers in her ears shifted to what sounded unmistakably like a funeral dirge. "Mom," Elton signed urgently, "the lady says we have to choose." "Choose what?" But even as her hands moved, Melody felt the answer settling into her heart like lead. Agent Morse was speaking into a backup radio now, coordinating with county services. "I need immediate placement for a 7-year-old male, possible psychiatric evaluation for the Guardian. Yes, tonight. I don't care about the storm." The room erupted in protests from the healed neighbors, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. All Melody could hear was the supernatural chorus growing fainter, as if the very forces that had enabled tonight's miracles were withdrawing in the face of institutional authority. Dr. Webb pulled himself upright, using the wall for support, his frost-burned hands wrapped in Mrs. Peterson's kitchen towels. When he spoke, his voice carried a broken quality that hadn't been there before. "Agent Morse, I need to revise my assessment. What I witnessed here, it defies conventional explanation. Doctor, you're clearly in shock. What you experienced was likely some form of localized hypothermic episode, possibly triggered by electrical malfunction." "I heard voices in Latin," he interrupted. "I saw images of events I couldn't possibly know about. That statue, it's not a fraud." But Agent Morse was beyond listening to anyone who contradicted her predetermined narrative. She approached Melody with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having legal authority trump everything else, even miracles. "Mrs. Burns, I'm placing your son in emergency protective custody pending a full investigation. You'll be allowed supervised visits while we determine—" "No." The word came out as barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a mother's breaking heart. Elton looked up at her, his 7-year-old eyes filled with understanding beyond his years. "It's okay, Mom. The lady says this isn't the end." But as Agent Morse radioed for backup and Father Mackenzie's official delegation stamped snow off their boots at the front door, Melody knew that her simple life as a deaf seamstress raising her son in rural Nebraska was over forever. The statue that had brought such hope and healing would either be confiscated as evidence or locked away in church vaults pending official verification. The Latin prayers faded to silence just as the first set of government headlights pierced the storm outside. Whatever window had opened between the divine and earthly realms was closing, leaving behind only the devastating aftermath of human bureaucracy trying to contain the infinite. In her hands, the little marble statue grew as cold and lifeless as ordinary stone. The miracle was ending, and she was about to lose everything that mattered most. The statue's sudden lifelessness struck Melody like a physical blow, but it was Elton's sharp intake of breath that made her look down at him with true alarm. Her son's face had gone ashen, his 7-year-old features twisted with an expression of profound loss that seemed too old for his small frame. "She's gone," he whispered, his hands moving in stunted signs. "The lady, she left." Before Melody could respond, the kitchen door swung open with deliberate force, admitting Father Mackenzie and 2 other priests she didn't recognize. The elderly priest's face was grim, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by something approaching dread. "Everyone needs to step away from the statue," he announced, his voice carrying an authority that made even Agent Morse pause. "Now." Dr. Webb, still cradling his frost-burned hands, looked up with desperate hope. "Father, you have to understand. What I witnessed here defies everything I thought I knew about." "Doctor, I know exactly what you witnessed." Father Mackenzie's interruption was sharp. "The question is whether Mrs. Burns understands what she's been harboring." The priest's words sent ice through Melody's veins, but it was the way he avoided looking directly at the statue that truly frightened her. This wasn't the reaction of someone investigating a potential miracle. This was the behavior of someone who had arrived already knowing what they would find. "Father Mackenzie," Sheriff Garrett said carefully, "we've got a delicate situation here. Child Services is involved now and—" "Sheriff, with respect, this situation is far beyond your jurisdiction." One of the unknown priests stepped forward, his collar marking him as someone of higher authority than their local clergyman. "I am Bishop Toretti from the Omaha Diocese. We've been monitoring reports of supernatural activity in this area for the past 48 hours. 48 hours. Melody's mind reeled. That meant they had known about the statue's power since almost the moment it had first awakened. How long had they been watching her family? How much did they know that she didn't? Elton pressed closer to her side, his small body trembling. "Mom, they're going to take it away." But as Melody looked around the room, at Agent Morse's determined expression, at the bishop's carefully controlled urgency, at the healed neighbors who suddenly seemed afraid to meet her eyes, she began to understand that losing the statue might be the least of her worries. "Mrs. Burns," Bishop Toretti's voice was deceptively gentle, "we need you to tell us exactly where your son found that statue, the precise location, the depth it was buried, any unusual circumstances surrounding its discovery." The question hit her like a revelation. This wasn't about authentication or investigation. They already knew what the statue was. They had always known. "You were expecting this," she said, the words falling from her lips as pieces of a larger puzzle suddenly aligned in her mind. "You knew what Elton would find in our garden." Father Mackenzie's face crumpled with something approaching grief. "Melody, your grandmother—" "My grandmother died 50 years ago in a church fire," she interrupted, her voice growing stronger as understanding crashed over her in waves. The same fire where a statue went missing. The same statue my son just happened to dig up in our backyard 3 days before Christmas. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Agent Morse had stopped her radio chatter, sensing that the conversation had shifted into territory beyond her bureaucratic understanding. It wasn't coincidence, Melody continued, her hands moving automatically to translate for Elton even as her world reorganized itself around terrible new truths. Our house, it's built on the old church property, isn't it? The burned church where my grandmother died. Bishop Toretti exchanged a glance with Father Mackenzie that confirmed everything. Mrs. Burns, your grandmother was Sister Catherine Brennan. She died protecting sacred relics from thieves who set fire to St. Agatha's mission in 1937. The statue was never found because she buried it in the church garden before they killed her. Melody finished, the words tasting like ashes. She buried it where she knew someone would eventually find it. Someone from her family. Elton looked up at her with eyes that held knowledge far beyond his years. The lady in the kitchen. She had your grandmother's face. The revelation struck Melody like lightning. The mysterious woman who had been guiding Elton throughout this ordeal, appearing to him, giving him advice, telling him where to dig, had been her grandmother's spirit. Sister Catherine had been orchestrating everything from beyond the grave, ensuring that the statue would find its way to family hands when it was needed most. But if that was true, then everything that had happened, the healings, the miracles, even the authorities arriving to threaten their family, it'd been part of some larger plan that she was only beginning to understand. What did she want? Melody whispered, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Father Mackenzie stepped forward, his aged face heavy with sorrow. The same thing she wanted 50 years ago, child, to protect something sacred from those who would use it for their own purposes. Outside, more vehicles were arriving, their headlights cutting through the storm, like search beams hunting for something precious that had been lost far too long. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the night like a death knell, but instead of the paralyzing fear that had gripped her moments before, Melody felt something entirely unexpected rising in her chest, fierce, protective determination. Her grandmother had died protecting this statue 50 years ago. She would not let Sister Catherine's sacrifice be meaningless. How many people know? She asked Bishop Toretti, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. About my grandmother, about what really happened at St. Agatha's? The bishop's hesitation told her everything. The church records were largely destroyed in the fire. Only a few of us remember the full story. Which means the people arriving outside don't know they're walking into a family legacy. Melody looked around the room, seeing her neighbors with new eyes. Not just people who had witnessed miracles, but potential allies who had been personally touched by the statue's power. They think this is just another case of religious hysteria to be managed and contained. Agent Morse stepped forward impatiently. Mrs. Burns, regardless of your family history, my priority is your son's welfare. These supernatural episodes represent a clear danger. The only danger, Mrs. Peterson interrupted, her elderly voice sharp with sudden anger, comes from people who want to cage miracles like laboratory specimens. To Melody's surprise, other voices joined in agreement. Mrs. Kowalski moved protectively closer to her granddaughter Anna. Dr. Webb, despite his frost-burned hands, positioned himself between Agent Morse and the statue. Even Sheriff Garrett seemed to be reconsidering his position as he watched the healed neighbors form an unconscious barrier around Melody and Elton. You all witnessed what happened here tonight, Melody continued, her confidence growing as she saw the effect of her words. Real healing. Impossible healing. Are you willing to let them take that away and lock it in some government facility where it will help no one? Father Mackenzie stepped forward, his weathered face thoughtful. Melody, what are you proposing? Before she could answer, Elton tugged at her sleeve, his small fingers moving in urgent signs. The lady's back. She says to tell them about the other hiding places. Melody's breath caught. Other hiding places? Grandmother Catherine didn't just hide one statue, Elton continued, his 7-year-old voice carrying conviction that silenced the room. She hid lots of things, all over Nebraska, places where her family would eventually live. The implications hit Melody like lightning. If Sister Catherine had possessed the gift of foresight that seemed to run in their bloodline, she might have created an entire network of hidden sacred objects, waiting for family members to discover them when they were needed most. The statue in their living room wasn't an isolated miracle, it was part of something much larger. Bishop Toretti's face had gone pale. How could she possibly know where her descendants would settle? The same way she knew to tell Elton where to dig, Melody replied, pieces of understanding clicking into place. The same way she's been guiding us through all of this. Death doesn't seem to have limited her ability to protect what matters to her. Dr. Webb looked up from his injured hands, scientific skepticism warring with recent impossible experience. Are you suggesting there are other artifacts, other locations where similar phenomena might occur? I'm suggesting, Melody said, her voice growing stronger with each word, that my grandmother created something the authorities can't simply confiscate and study. She created a legacy that spans generations and locations. Even if they take this statue, even if they separate me from Elton, the miracles will continue elsewhere. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Agent Morse's radio crackled with static, her backup demanding status updates she couldn't provide. Outside, more vehicles were arriving, but now the sound felt less like a threat and more like confirmation that they were dealing with something far beyond ordinary bureaucratic management. Father Mackenzie moved closer to Melody, lowering his voice. Child, if what you're saying is true, then the Church needs to reconsider how we approach this. The Vatican has protocols for miraculous phenomena, but they assume isolated incidents, not network of active sites. Then maybe it's time for new protocols, Melody replied. Maybe my grandmother knew that the world would need miracles that couldn't be controlled or contained by institutions. Sheriff Garrett cleared his throat uncomfortably. I hate to interrupt this theological discussion, but we still have immediate practical problems. Agent Morse isn't going to just walk away. Melody looked down at Elton, seeing her own determination reflected in his young face. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, armed with the knowledge that they weren't fighting just for themselves, but for a sacred trust that had been 50 years in the making. Then we give them a choice, she said quietly. They can try to suppress something that's clearly beyond their ability to control, or they can help us figure out how to use it responsibly. Outside, the first of the backup vehicles came to a stop, their headlights illuminating a farmhouse that had become the center of something unprecedented. The gathering storm was about to test everything they had discovered about faith, family, and the price of protecting miracles in a world determined to explain them away. Through the frost-covered kitchen window, Melody watched Agent Morse's backup team emerge from their vehicles, like soldiers preparing for siege. But where fear should have paralyzed her, she felt an unexpected clarity settling over her thoughts. The truth about her grandmother's legacy had changed everything, not just what they were protecting, but how they would protect it. Elton, she signed quietly, can you ask your great-grandmother where the nearest hiding place is? Her son's eyes went distant for a moment, that familiar look of concentration that meant he was listening to voices only he could hear. When he focused on her again, his small face was grave with importance. Lincoln, he signed back, under the old cathedral. Grandmother Catherine says there's a family living there now, the Hendersons. Their little girl has been sick for months. Bishop Toretti overheard and stepped closer, his expression shifting from alarm to something approaching awe. The Henderson child. We've been praying for her. The doctors have exhausted all treatments. Melody felt the pieces of her grandmother's plan crystallizing with stunning clarity. Sister Catherine hadn't just hidden sacred objects randomly, she had positioned them where they would be needed most, orchestrated by a divine foresight that spanned decades. Each hiding place corresponded to a family that would eventually require intervention, creating an invisible network of miracles waiting to unfold across Nebraska. "How many families?" Dr. Webb asked, his scientific mind grappling with implications that defied everything he thought he understood about causation and planning. "7 more," Elton replied without hesitation. "All with children, all waiting." Agent Morse's radio crackled sharply, cutting through the moment. "Base, this is Morse. I need immediate coordination with Lincoln Field Office, Grand Island and—" She paused, clearly receiving instructions that were changing her mission parameters in real time. "Roger that. Expanding investigation to statewide scope." Melody's stomach dropped. Somehow, the federal authorities were already learning about the other locations. Either they had capabilities beyond what she had imagined, or someone else was providing them information about her grandmother's network. "They know," Sheriff Garrett said quietly, monitoring his own radio traffic. "FBI field offices across the state are mobilizing. They're planning simultaneous raids on multiple locations tonight." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Father Mackenzie's face crumpled with anguish. "Those families have no idea what's coming. They'll be completely unprepared." But instead of despair, Melody felt something fierce and protective igniting in her chest. Her grandmother had spent 50 years orchestrating this moment, positioning miracles where they would be needed most. She would not let federal bureaucracy destroy that sacred work simply because they couldn't understand it. "Then we warn them," she said, her voice cutting through the room with sudden authority. "We call every location and tell those families what's coming. Give them the same choice we're making, protect what's sacred or let it be confiscated and studied until it loses all meaning." Mrs. Peterson moved to her side with surprising determination. "I still have my sister's phone tree from the church auxiliary. Between all of us, we can reach 7 families in less than an hour." "And tell them what exactly?" Agent Morse demanded, her professional composure finally cracking. "That they should resist federal investigation. That they should encourage children to participate in supernatural phenomena that could be psychologically damaging." "Tell them the truth," Melody replied, meeting the agent's challenging stare without flinching. "That they have a choice between miracles that serve healing and hope, or evidence that serves bureaucratic control." Dr. Webb struggled to his feet, his frost-burned hands wrapped in kitchen towels, but his voice steady with new conviction. "Agent Morse, I'm revising my official assessment. What I witnessed here tonight wasn't harmful delusion. It was genuine healing that conventional medicine couldn't achieve. These families deserve to know that alternative exists." The sound of approaching footsteps on the front porch cut short any response. Through the window, Melody could see federal agents and church officials coordinating their approach, their flashlight beams cutting through the storm like searchlights hunting for something precious that had been hidden too long. "Elton," she whispered, kneeling to meet her son's eyes, "can you tell your great-grandmother that we understand now? That we're going to finish what she started?" Her son's face lit up with a smile that seemed to carry sunlight despite the chaos surrounding them. "She says she's been waiting 50 years for someone in the family to say that." Outside, Agent Morse's radio erupted with status updates from across the state as federal teams moved toward locations where miracles lay hidden in darkness, waiting for discovery. The final confrontation was beginning, and it would determine whether Sister Catherine's legacy of healing would flourish or be buried forever under institutional suspicion. Melody stood, pulling Elton close, and faced the approaching authorities with the knowledge that she was no longer just protecting her son. She was protecting a sacred trust that connected past and future through the unbreakable bonds of family, faith, and divine intervention. The road back to ordinary life was closed forever. The only path forward led through miracle and mystery toward something unprecedented. The front door burst open, bringing with it a whirlwind of snow and the harsh beam of federal flashlights that cut through the warm lamplight of their living room like judgment itself. Agent Morse led the charge, followed by 3 additional federal agents whose faces carried the grim efficiency of people accustomed to containing situations they didn't understand. "Nobody move," the lead agent commanded, his weapon drawn but pointed toward the floor. This is now an active federal investigation scene. But instead of the cowering compliance they clearly expected, the agent found himself facing something unprecedented. A room full of people who had positioned themselves protectively around a 7-year-old boy and his deaf mother, their faces united not by fear, but by shared witness to impossible healing. Melody felt the weight of 50 years of family legacy settling on her shoulders as she stepped forward, Elton's small hand clasped firmly in hers. Everything her grandmother had died protecting, everything Sister Catherine had orchestrated across decades of divine foresight, had led to this moment. The ultimate test wasn't about the statue anymore. It was about whether faith could triumph over institutional control. "Agent Morse," she said, her voice carrying a new authority that surprised even herself. "Before you proceed, there's something you need to understand. This isn't an isolated incident you can contain and study. Mrs. Burns, step away from the child." 7 families, Melody continued, speaking over the agent's protocol demands. 7 locations across Nebraska where your teams are moving right now. Children who desperately need healing that conventional medicine can't provide. Sacred objects that have been waiting decades to serve their purpose. The lead agent's radio erupted with status reports that confirmed her words. Team 3 approaching Lincoln target. Grand Island team in position. Kearney location secured. Bishop Toretti moved to stand beside Melody, his ecclesiastical authority adding weight to her defiance. Agent Richardson. He addressed the lead agent by name, clearly recognizing him from previous church-state encounters. The Catholic Church is prepared to formally invoke sanctuary protocols. These artifacts represent legitimate religious phenomena that fall under our institutional protection. Your institutional protection failed 50 years ago, Agent Richardson replied coldly. Sister Catherine Brennan died because the church couldn't adequately safeguard these objects. We won't make that mistake again. The casual mention of her grandmother's death struck Melody like a physical blow, but instead of weakening her resolve, it crystallized her understanding of what was truly at stake. They knew. The federal authorities had always known about Sister Catherine, about the network of hidden artifacts, about the family bloodline that could activate them. This wasn't investigation, it was harvesting. "You want to study miracles like laboratory specimens," she said, her hands moving to translate for Elton, even as her voice rose with passionate conviction. "Turn healing into data points and wonder into bureaucratic procedures. But my grandmother didn't die protecting these objects, so you could lock them away in government facilities." Dr. Webb struggled forward, his frost-burned hands still wrapped in kitchen towels, but his medical authority intact. "Agent Richardson, I'm filing an official report that contradicts your threat assessment. What occurred here tonight represents breakthrough therapeutic intervention that could revolutionize treatment protocols for dozens of conditions. The children in Lincoln, Grand Island, and Kearney don't need revolutionary treatment protocols," Mrs. Peterson added, her elderly voice sharp with maternal protectiveness. "They need miracles. Tonight, before your people arrive to confiscate their only hope." Agent Morse's radio crackled with an urgent update. "Base, this is Lincoln team. The Henderson family is refusing to cooperate. They claim their daughter was just healed by touching something they won't surrender, requesting additional support units." Melody's heart soared. The phone tree had worked. The families were fighting back, choosing faith over authority, miracles over institutional control. Her grandmother's network was activating exactly as Sister Catherine had planned, creating a statewide confrontation that no single federal team could manage. "It's happening everywhere, isn't it?" she said to Agent Richardson, watching his face as more radio reports flooded in. Families who thought their children were dying suddenly discovering they have access to healing you can't confiscate, objects you can't simply seize because they're protected by people who have nothing left to lose. Elton tugged at her hand, his small fingers moving in urgent signs. "Great-grandmother says to tell them about the test." "What test?" Melody asked. kneeling to her son's level even as armed agents surrounded them. "The one they're failing right now," Elton replied, his 7-year-old voice carrying wisdom that silenced the room. "She says miracles only work for people who choose love over control. That's why the bad men 50 years ago couldn't use the statue even after they stole it. That's why these men won't be able to either." The profound simplicity of the truth struck everyone present like lightning. Sister Catherine hadn't just hidden sacred objects, she had created a test that would separate those worthy of miracles from those who would exploit them. The federal authorities could confiscate every artifact in Nebraska, but without the faith, humility, and pure intention that activated them, they would possess nothing more than elaborate religious decorations. Agent Richardson's radio exploded with frustrated reports from across the state as his teams discovered what Elton had just revealed. The objects were becoming ordinary stone and metal the moment hostile hands touched them. The test was complete, and the authorities were failing spectacularly. The room erupted into chaos as Agent Richardson's radio unleashed a torrent of panicked reports from federal teams across Nebraska. "Base, the artifact has gone inert." Lincoln team reporting complete loss of anomalous properties. Grand Island object showing no unusual characteristics, requesting instruction. Melody watched Agent Richardson's face cycle through disbelief, fury, and something approaching desperate comprehension. The federal government's most sophisticated containment operation was crumbling in real time, undone by the simple spiritual mathematics her grandmother had embedded in every hidden miracle 50 years ago. "This is impossible," Dr. Webb whispered, his scientific worldview shattering as he witnessed the selective nature of divine intervention. "The objects are choosing who can access their properties." "Not choosing," Elton corrected with 7-year-old precision, his small voice cutting through the adult confusion like a blade of pure truth. "Testing. Great-grandmother says love and control can't exist in the same heart. You have to pick one." Agent Richardson stepped forward, his professional composure fracturing as decades of federal protocol proved utterly useless against spiritual laws that predated government by millennia. "Mrs. Burns, you're interfering with a national security investigation." "What investigation?" Melody demanded, rising to face him with newfound courage that seemed to flow directly from her grandmother's spirit. "You came here to steal healing from dying children, to turn miracles into weapons or study them until they lost all meaning. That's not investigation, that's spiritual grave robbing." The statue on their mantelpiece began to glow with soft, warm light that bathed the room in golden radiance, responding to the confrontation with divine energy that made every federal agent step back involuntarily. The Virgin Mary's marble features seemed to shift, her expression radiating both infinite compassion and absolute protection for the family standing beneath her blessing. "Look at it," Father Mackenzie whispered in awe, his ecclesiastical training providing no framework for what he was witnessing. "The object is defending itself, defending them." Agent Richardson drew his weapon with trembling hands, pointing it at Melody, even as his radio continued broadcasting the complete failure of simultaneous federal operations across the state. "Step away from the artifact. We have protocols for containing supernatural phenomena." "Your protocols are worthless," Bishop Toretti declared, moving between the armed agent and the Burns family with episcopal authority that seemed to carry physical weight. "This isn't supernatural phenomena. This is divine intervention protecting itself from those who would corrupt its purpose." Elton tugged at his mother's sleeve, his eyes bright with excitement as invisible conversation continued with his great-grandmother's spirit. "She says to tell them about the real choice, the one they still have time to make." Melody knelt beside her son, her hands moving in gentle sign language that somehow seemed to include everyone present in its graceful communication. "What choice, sweetheart? They can keep trying to control miracles and watch them disappear forever," Elton explained, his voice carrying wisdom that reduced grown adults to stunned silence. "Or they can help protect the families who need healing. Be servants instead of masters. The profound simplicity of the ultimatum hit Agent Richardson like a physical blow. His radio crackled with reports of objects becoming ordinary stone, of healing properties vanishing the moment federal hands tried to claim them, of families across Nebraska whose last hope for dying children was dissolving under institutional pressure. "You're asking federal agents to abandon their mission," he said, but his voice carried doubt instead of conviction. "We're asking human beings to choose correctly," Melody replied, standing with her son's hand in hers and 50 years of family legacy flowing through her words. "My grandmother died protecting these miracles from people who saw them as power to be seized. She created a test that would ensure they could only serve love." The statue's glow intensified, and suddenly every person in the room could feel it, the presence of Sister Catherine Brennan, the woman who had orchestrated this moment across decades of divine foresight, offering one final opportunity for redemption even to those who had come as enemies. Dr. Webb lowered his hands, his frost-burned fingers healing visibly in the statue's radiance. "Agent Richardson, I'm formally recommending we revise our approach. The therapeutic applications alone could revolutionize medical treatment, but only if we work with these families instead of against them." Agent Morse stepped forward, holstering her weapon as understanding dawned in her eyes. "Sir, if the objects only function for those with genuine healing intentions, then perhaps our role should be protection rather than confiscation." The room held its breath as Agent Richardson faced the ultimate confrontation, not between federal authority and religious phenomena, but between the human capacity for control and the divine demand for humility. His radio fell silent, waiting for orders that would determine whether Sister Catherine's 50-year plan would culminate in triumph or tragedy. Elton looked up at the armed federal agent with eyes that held no fear, only patient expectation, as if he already knew which choice a good man would ultimately make when faced with the simple test that separated servants of healing from servants of power. Agent Richardson's hand trembled as he stared at the glowing statue, his weapon feeling heavier with each passing second. The radio reports had stopped coming. 7 federal teams across Nebraska reduced to confused silence as miracles dissolved under their institutional touch. 50 years of Sister Catherine's planning had culminated in this moment, and Melody could feel her grandmother's presence filling the room like warm light. "Sir," Agent Morse whispered urgently, "the objects are completely inert at every location. Whatever's happening here, forcing it won't work." But Melody saw something deeper in Richardson's eyes, recognition that his entire worldview was crumbling. He wasn't just facing the failure of a federal operation, he was confronting the devastating truth that some powers couldn't be controlled, only served. "What do you want from us?" Richardson asked, his voice breaking with exhaustion and something approaching surrender. Elton stepped forward, his small hand reaching toward the trembling federal agent with fearless compassion. "Great-grandmother says you have to choose what you love more, being powerful or being helpful." The simple question hit Richardson like a physical blow. Melody watched him struggle with the implications, knowing this moment would determine not just the fate of 7 miraculous artifacts, but the spiritual direction of everyone present. "I became an agent to protect people," Richardson whispered, lowering his weapon. "But somewhere along the way, I started protecting institutions instead." The statue's glow intensified, and suddenly Richardson gasped as memories flooded through him. Every case where his desire for control had overridden his commitment to genuine service, every moment when federal protocol had mattered more than human need. "The children in Lincoln," he said, his radio crackling back to life. "Grand Island, Kearney, they're all still sick, aren't they? Because we made the miracles disappear." Dr. Webb nodded gravely. "The Henderson girl in Lincoln has hours, maybe less. The artifacts were their last hope." Melody felt her heart breaking as she realized the terrible cost of this confrontation. Victory against federal overreach meant nothing if children died while adults fought over spiritual authority. Her grandmother had spent 50 years orchestrating this network of healing, but now institutional interference was destroying the very lives it was meant to save. "There has to be another way," she said desperately, turning to Elton. "Can you ask great-grandmother? Is there anything we can do?" Elton's face lit up with sudden understanding, then dimmed with solemn recognition of what was required. "She says yes, but it costs everything. The miracles can work again, but only if someone carries them personally to each family, someone with the bloodline." The implications crashed over Melody like a wave of cold understanding. 7 locations across Nebraska. 7 dying children who needed immediate intervention, and only one person whose family connection could reactivate the dormant artifacts. "You're talking about leaving," she whispered, her voice hollow with comprehension. "Leaving our home, our life here, everything we've built." "Not leaving," Elton corrected gently. "Becoming what great-grandmother always was, a keeper of miracles. Someone who goes where healing is needed instead of waiting for people to come to us." Bishop Toretti stepped forward with ecclesiastical understanding. A pilgrimage, a living ministry that serves divine intervention wherever children are dying and conventional medicine has failed. Melody looked around their small farmhouse, the kitchen where she'd taught Elton to bake bread, the living room where they'd spent countless quiet evenings, the bedroom where his father's photograph still watched over them with loving protection. This place represented everything they'd built from grief and loss, their sanctuary against a world that had taken too much already. "If we do this," she said slowly, "we can never come home again. Not really. We'll belong to the miracles instead of ourselves." Agent Richardson holstered his weapon completely, his face transformed by newfound understanding. "Mrs. Burns, if you're willing to make that sacrifice, the federal government can provide protection, safe passage between locations, official clearance that prevents any interference with your work." "And the cost?" Dr. Webb asked quietly, his medical training recognizing the profound implications. "What happens to Elton? To your life together?" Melody knelt beside her son, her hands trembling as she signed the question that would determine both their futures. "Sweetheart, do you understand what this means? We'd spend our lives traveling, helping families we've never met, carrying great-grandmother's work to places where children are dying." Elton's 7-year-old face carried wisdom that seemed borrowed from eternity itself. "Mama, what if staying safe here means letting other kids die? Great-grandmother says the miracles belong to everyone, not just us." The statue's glow bathed them both in golden light as Melody realized the true nature of her grandmother's 50-year plan. Sister Catherine hadn't just hidden miracles, she'd been waiting for family members willing to become living instruments of divine intervention, people who would choose service over security. Outside, the blizzard was ending, revealing clear stars that seemed to shine with approval as Melody Burns faced the choice that would transform her from a grieving widow into something unprecedented, a mother and son whose love for each other would now serve healing across the world. The weight of decision settled over the farmhouse like the last snowflakes of the dying blizzard. Melody looked into her son's eyes, those bright, fearless eyes that had seen his great-grandmother's spirit and accepted miracle as naturally as morning light, and felt the final pieces of her old life falling away like autumn leaves. "He'll do it," she whispered, her voice carrying across the sudden silence of the room with absolute certainty. "We'll carry the miracles to those children." The moment her words left her lips, the statue blazed with golden radiance, so brilliant that everyone present had to shield their eyes. When the light faded, they found themselves witnessing something that would reshape their understanding of divine intervention forever. 6 additional statues materialized on the mantelpiece, each identical to the original, each glowing with its own sacred fire. "One for each location," Elton explained matter-of-factly, as if miracles were simply practical solutions to logistical problems. "Great-grandmother says she's been saving them up for 50 years, waiting for the right keeper." Agent Richardson stared at the transformed mantelpiece, his radio crackling back to life with excited reports from his teams across Nebraska. "Base, the artifacts are reactivating." Lincoln team reporting renewed anomalous properties. Grand Island object showing full therapeutic potential. Something was different now. The voices on the radio carried wonder instead of clinical detachment, awe instead of acquisitive hunger. The federal agents scattered across the state were experiencing their own moments of spiritual confrontation, forced to choose between exploitation and service, just as Richardson had been. Dr. Webb approached the statues with trembling hands, his medical training warring with empirical impossibility. "Mrs. Burns, do you understand what this means for modern medicine? The therapeutic applications could revolutionize treatment for conditions we've considered hopeless." "It means children will live," Melody replied simply, lifting one of the glowing statues with hands that no longer trembled. "Everything else is just details." Father Mackenzie and Bishop Toretti exchanged glances heavy with ecclesiastical significance. They were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in modern Christianity, a mobile ministry of miracles, a family called to carry divine intervention directly to the places where conventional faith had failed. "The Church will provide official recognition," Bishop Toretti declared, his voice carrying the weight of Vatican authority. "Canonical protection for your work. You'll have full ecclesiastical support." Agent Richardson nodded with newfound respect. "Federal protection as well, safe passage, expedited travel clearances, whatever you need to reach these families without interference." But Melody barely heard the institutional promises. Her attention was focused on the profound transformation occurring within herself, the dissolution of everything she had been in favor of something she couldn't yet fully comprehend. The deaf seamstress who had spent years grieving her husband's death was becoming something Sister Catherine had envisioned across decades of divine planning, a living vessel for miracles that belonged to all humanity. "What about our life here?" she asked Elton, gesturing around the farmhouse that had been their sanctuary. "Our home, our routines, everything that makes us, us?" Elton's face brightened with 7-year-old wisdom that seemed to flow directly from his great-grandmother's spirit. "Mama, we're not losing our family. We're making it bigger. Every child we help becomes part of us." The truth of his words settled over Melody like warm light. This wasn't about abandoning their life together. It was about expanding their definition of family to include every desperate parent, every dying child, every family whose last hope resided in miracles they couldn't access without help. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I'll maintain the house. Keep it ready for when you need to come home." "Thank you," Melody whispered, understanding that home would now be wherever healing was needed most urgently, wherever their strange calling led them next. The radio crackled with Agent Morse's voice. "Sir, the Henderson family in Lincoln is requesting immediate contact. Their daughter is responding to proximity with a reactivated artifact, but they need direct intervention." Melody looked around the room one final time, at Father Mackenzie, whose faith had been tested and strengthened, at Dr. Webb, whose scientific worldview had expanded to include divine intervention, at Agent Richardson, whose federal authority had been transformed into sacred service. Each of them had been changed by witnessing what happened when institutional control surrendered to spiritual truth. "Then we go to Lincoln first," she said, lifting her son and reaching for their coats, together. As they prepared to leave their farmhouse for what might be the last time as ordinary people, Melody felt Sister Catherine's presence surrounding them both with protective blessing. Her grandmother's 50-year plan was complete, but their real work was just beginning. Outside, the Nebraska winter sparkled under starlight that seemed to illuminate a path stretching far beyond their small rural world, calling them toward a future where love would always matter more than control, and miracles would flow through human hearts, willing to serve something greater than themselves. The phone began ringing with calls from desperate families, and Melody Burns stepped into a new life as a keeper of divine intervention. The return. 2 months later, Melody Burns stood in the doorway of their Nebraska farmhouse, her hands moving in sign language that had become fluent in ways she never imagined possible, not just communicating with Elton, but somehow translating the wordless gratitude of families whose children now played in distant yards instead of lying in hospital beds. "It feels different," Elton observed, his small suitcase in one hand, a seventh statue glowing softly in the other, like the house is proud of us. He was right. The rooms that had once held their grief now seemed to pulse with quiet satisfaction, as if the walls themselves understood that their former occupants had transformed from people who needed sanctuary into people who carried sanctuary with them wherever they went. Mrs. Peterson emerged from the kitchen, her weathered face beaming with the particular joy of someone whose purpose had been renewed by caring for something sacred. "The Henderson girl in Lincoln sent another drawing," she announced, holding up a crayon masterpiece depicting stick figures with halos. "And Mrs. Rodriguez from Grand Island called. Little Miguel took his first steps yesterday." Melody accepted the drawing with hands that no longer trembled, studying the innocent artistry of a child who would have died without intervention. 7 families across 3 states had learned to associate the Burns name with impossible hope, and each success had changed something fundamental in Melody's understanding of what it meant to be useful in the world. "The difference isn't in the miracles," she said quietly, more to herself than to Mrs. Peterson. "It's in discovering we were always meant to share them." Dr. Webb's government-issued sedan pulled into their driveway, followed by Agent Richardson's black SUV. Over the past weeks, an unlikely partnership had developed between federal protection and divine intervention, with Richardson's team serving as guardian angels for a ministry that operated beyond conventional understanding of either religion or science. "Ready for Houston?" Dr. Webb called. Emerging from his vehicle with medical files that chronicled the impossible, children with terminal conditions responding to proximity with the sacred statues, families whose desperate prayers were being answered through the willingness of one mother and son to carry miracles personally to hospital bedsides. But it was Agent Richardson who approached with the news that would test everything they had learned about the cost of serving something greater than themselves. His expression carried both official gravity and personal concern as he handed Melody a classified report. "The Vatican wants to meet with you," he said carefully. "Official recognition of your ministry. Ecclesiastical protection that would make your work permanent church doctrine." Melody read the formal invitation, her heart racing as she recognized the magnitude of what was being offered. Official sainthood consideration, Vatican resources, global reach that could extend their healing ministry to children dying on every continent. "And the cost?" she asked, because 2 months of carrying miracles had taught her that every expansion of their calling came with deeper surrender of conventional life. "Rome," Richardson replied simply. "Permanent relocation, Elton's education in Vatican schools, your complete transformation from American citizens into church representatives." The weight of the choice pressed down on Melody with familiar intensity, but this time something was different. Instead of the desperate uncertainty that had characterized her earlier decisions, she felt a calm certainty flowing through her like warm water. Sister Catherine's 50-year plan had prepared her not just for individual moments of spiritual crisis, but for a lifetime of choosing service over security. "What do you think, sweetheart?" she asked Elton, kneeling to meet his eyes directly. "Ready to help children all over the world?" His 7-year-old face lit up with excitement that carried no trace of fear, only anticipation for adventures in healing that would stretch across continents. "Great-grandmother says there are kids everywhere who need us, in places with funny languages and different food, and mothers who cry in ways that sound different but mean the same thing." The truth of his words settled over Melody like recognition of destiny finally accepted. She was no longer the grieving widow who had struggled to raise her son alone in rural isolation. The miracles hadn't just healed other families, they had transformed her into someone capable of carrying hope to places where conventional medicine and traditional faith had both failed. "Then we go to Rome," she said, her voice carrying certainty that surprised even herself. "After Houston, after we help that little boy in Texas who's been waiting for us." As they loaded their simple belongings into the federal vehicles, Melody felt the presence of everyone whose lives had intersected with their impossible journey. Father Mackenzie, whose faith had been strengthened by witnessing divine intervention in action, the families whose children now drew pictures of healing instead of saying goodbye, even the federal agents who had learned to serve miracles instead of controlling them. But strongest of all, she felt Sister Catherine's presence surrounding them with protective blessing as they prepared to carry 50 years of sacred planning into a future where institutional authority would finally serve healing instead of hindering it. The Nebraska farmhouse watched them leave with walls that seemed to glow with quiet pride, knowing it had sheltered the transformation of ordinary people into living instruments of divine intervention. The new beginning. 1 year later, Melody Burns stood in the Vatican Gardens watching her son teach a group of international children how to sign miracle in American Sign Language. The afternoon Roman sun cast golden light across ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of faith, but something about this particular moment felt unprecedented. 8-year-old Elton surrounded by kids from 6 different continents, all of them survivors whose families had been touched by the traveling ministry that had become their life. "Miracolo," whispered Maria from Colombia, her small fingers forming the careful gestures. Her brain tumor had disappeared after 3 days with one of the sacred statues. Beside her, Chen from Beijing nodded solemnly as he practiced the sign. His leukemia had entered complete remission during their visit to his family's hospital room in Shanghai. Each child represented a journey, a desperate family's last hope that had been answered through divine intervention, carried personally to their bedsides. Melody's hands moved automatically to the small statue she now carried everywhere, its familiar weight a constant reminder of how completely her life had been transformed. The deaf seamstress who had once struggled to communicate with her own son's teachers now served as official Vatican liaison for miraculous healing, translating impossible hope across language barriers that dissolved in the face of answered prayers. "The Ethiopian delegation arrives tomorrow," Cardinal Benedetti informed her in fluent sign language, his elderly hands moving with practiced grace. 15 children. The refugee camp conditions are challenging, but your success in Somalia last month proved that divine intervention transcends even the most desperate circumstances. Somalia. Melody still felt the emotional weight of that journey, carrying sacred healing into a war zone where children died not from rare diseases, but from starvation and violence. The miracles had worked differently there, not just healing individual conditions, but somehow inspiring the creation of protected zones, where international aid could finally reach the families who needed it most. The statues had become catalysts for hope that extended far beyond medical intervention. "And after Ethiopia?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would involve another impossible journey, another group of dying children whose parents had learned to whisper the Burns name like a prayer. Tibet, Brazil, then back to Nebraska for Christmas. Nebraska. The word still carried the weight of home, even though the farmhouse they would return to served more as a spiritual retreat center than a family residence. Mrs. Peterson had transformed it into a place where families could stay while waiting for their turn with the healing statues, where desperate parents found community with others whose children faced terminal diagnoses. Elton ran toward her with arms outstretched. "Maria, a bad word in sign language," he announced with 8-year-old indignation. "She says impossible doesn't exist anymore because of the miracles." Melody laughed, lifting her son and marveling at how naturally he had adapted to their nomadic life of divine service. Vatican tutors traveled with them, ensuring his education continued across continents, but his real learning came from witnessing the transformation of families who had lost all hope until miracles arrived at their doorsteps. "Maybe Maria's right," Melody suggested, watching the international children continue their signing lesson under ancient olive trees. "Maybe impossible became an outdated word the day you found that statue in our garden." The memory of that December morning felt like something from another lifetime. 7-year-old Elton digging in frozen Nebraska soil, unearthing a divine intervention that would reshape not just their family, but their understanding of what ordinary people could become when they surrendered personal comfort for universal service. Agent Richardson approached with his daily security briefing, but his demeanor had evolved far beyond federal protection into something resembling priesthood. 2 months of guarding miracles had transformed him into someone who understood that his true job involved clearing bureaucratic obstacles from the path of divine intervention. The Brazilian government approved all travel documents, he reported, and Dr. Webb sent word from the Nebraska Medical Conference. Hospitals across 6 states are reporting sustained remissions in children who received statue interventions. The evidence is becoming impossible for the medical establishment to ignore. Impossible. There was that word again. Melody had learned that miracles didn't eliminate impossibility so much as redefine it as an invitation to expand faith beyond conventional limitations. Every dying child who survived their interventions, every family whose despair transformed into gratitude, every medical professional who learned to work alongside divine healing instead of dismissing it, they all represented impossibility overcome through willingness to serve something greater than personal understanding. "Mama," Elton said suddenly, his voice carrying the serious tone that always preceded messages from Sister Catherine's spirit. "Great-grandmother says to tell you something important." Melody knelt beside her son in the Vatican gardens, surrounded by children whose lives testified to the power of love, willing to travel anywhere healing was needed. "What does she want me to know?" "She says we're not carrying miracles anymore," Elton replied, his 8-year-old wisdom flowing from 50 years of sacred planning finally fulfilled. "We became them." The truth settled over Melody like warm light. They were no longer the grieving widow and orphaned child who had needed divine intervention to survive their isolation. They had transformed into living instruments of hope, carrying Sister Catherine's legacy into a future where institutional authority served healing, where federal protection enabled miracle delivery, where Vatican resources supported divine intervention, reaching every corner of the world where children died while their parents prayed for impossible salvation. As evening approached and the international children dispersed to their temporary Vatican housing, Melody Burns held her son close and felt the profound satisfaction of a life completely surrendered to service. Tomorrow would bring new journeys, new families, new children whose survival depended on miracles delivered personally by people willing to make their entire existence an offering of hope. The statues glowed softly in their protective cases, ready for Ethiopia, ready for wherever desperate love called them next. And Melody knew with absolute certainty that they would answer every call, carry healing to every bedside, serve divine intervention until the last child was saved. This was their new beginning, eternal service, infinite love, miraculous hope traveling wherever it was needed most.